Contested divorce, sometimes people talk about a child interview. So, what is a child interview? A child who is in the middle of a dispute between parents over custody or parenting time or some other child related issue can potentially be interviewed by different people, can be interviewed by a child psychologist, can be interviewed by what's called a guardian ad litem, someone appointed by the court to represent the best interests of the child, or sometimes by the judge him or herself. When I was on the bench, I interviewed many children. Not every case results in a child interview. There's some degree of judicial discretion, usually in these types of issues, depending on what the dispute is about, and also depending on the jurisdiction you're in. So, if you're represented by counsel, you may want to speak with your attorney about whether there will or will not be a child interview, whether you do or do not want to request that. But I can tell you that in my experience on the bench as a family court judge interviewing children, that I conducted many child interviews. And every case is different, every child is different. But in general, and I sat in New Jersey, so rules may be different in each state, but in general, the interview with a child tends to take place in what's called in camera, meaning outside the presence of parents and outside the presence really of other individuals, except for perhaps court staff. So, for example, when I interviewed a child in the middle of a contentious case between parents, um, I would be with the child, and there would be my law clerk, some court clerks, perhaps some other court staff, but that would essentially be it. And the reason for that, the reason why parents generally are not permitted in the room when a judge interviews a child is to help prevent against either parent influencing directly or indirectly what the child is going to say. Sometimes parents uh, attempt to influence what a child says, and sometimes they do it unconsciously just by their mere presence. And so when a judge interviews a child privately, they call that in camera. That's what that term means. Now, in my experience, I interviewed many children, and each child is different, obviously. Each child is unique. But I can tell you in my experience, when I interview children, regardless of age, regardless of background, there tended to be, in the majority of cases, not in every case, but in the majority, certain common themes that came up over and over and over again when I interviewed the children outside the presence of their parents. And two in particular. Number one, they tended to be upset, if not angry, at both parents, regardless of what the issue was, for putting them in that position. Generally, children did not want to be interviewed by the court, regardless of what the parents thought. Sometimes parents said, "Oh, you must interview the child. My child wants to come and speak with you," etc., etc. And even though I heard this over and over and over again, in the majority of cases, it was very clear they would rather be elsewhere. They did not want to be sitting in a position where they felt no matter what they said, they were going to disappoint one parent or the other. And on top of that, they were very aware, particularly teenagers and preteens. They were very aware, and they would say this, that they knew that their parents were spending time and energy and money on a process that could be spent on them for positive things, but was instead being spent on this process, the legal process. And so they felt some resentment to that, and they made that very, very well known. So that was number one, that regardless of whatever either parent felt the child was going to say, the child, regardless of what the parents asked them in their kitchen or living room, when they were alone with the court, they said something very, very different. That they did not want to be in this position, and that they really found fault with both parents for putting them in that position. Just something to think about. And number two, beyond whatever the issues may have been, what they really, really wanted in a lot of these cases was for the litigation to stop, for the fighting to stop, regardless of whether parents were fighting over who gets the child on Wednesdays versus Thursdays versus Columbus Day versus Halloween versus President's Day. They really didn't want to be involved with that. And if you think back when you were a child, when you were a teenager, more likely than not, the last thing on your mind was what your parents were thinking. You wanted to concentrate on your friends and your career and whatever your interests were. That's very natural as a child grows from being a child to a preteen to a teen to a young adult. That happens. Sometimes parents forget this. They're spending all this time and money fighting over a child who really just wants to be left alone, quite frankly, and wants to have a loving relationship with both parents. Every now and then, there'd be a case where a child really had a resentment towards one parent or the other, and sometimes it was legitimate, and sometimes it was very obvious to the court that they were parroting words that their parents put in their heads. Things like, children talking about the child support guidelines or equitable distribution. How would they know this unless one parent or the other was feeding their head? And when they would say these things, it would more often than not sound very robotic. It was pretty obvious when a child was being programmed to some degree by one parent or sometimes both. But for the most part, teenagers and preteens, and sometimes even younger than that, were very astute. They were very independent minded. They had this opportunity to speak outside of the presence of both parents. And when I would go back and give the parents and their attorneys a summary of what the children said, sometimes it would end the case because it would be an eye-opener to both parents that, what you're doing is hurting your child. You're not listening to your child. What you're forcing your child to say, directly or indirectly, in the comfort of your own home, is not necessarily what they're going to say in court, no matter what you may think. And so that's very important. If a case is being fueled by what you think a child is going to say, it may not be accurate. Now, children, regardless of age, whether they are 3 or 5 or 7 or 10 or 17 and a half, till they reach the age of majority, they are essentially under the jurisdiction of the court. And I can tell you, at least in my personal experience and professional experience, having been a judge in the family court, it's very clear to me that what children really need from their parents is positive role modeling, especially in a time when their parents are fighting with each other. What children don't need is to see their parents going at it toe to toe, because everything they learned up until that point, which is among other things that their parents are their rocks, are their support systems, that starts to fall apart when their parents are tearing each other down in front of their child or children, as the case may be. In times of stress, the children need to see positive role models. So when parents are able to do that, when they're able to, even in times of divorce, to build up the other side, to make the child feel stable, to make the child feel secure in a time of stress, in a time when their life is turning upside down, when they may be moving, when the world they knew is going to be changed because their parents no longer get along. To be able to work together or even independently in that context can be priceless for a child in a positive way. But some parents don't do that. They fight with each other and they say they're fighting for the best interest of the child, but that's not really how they're acting. They're hurting their child, whether they see that or not. That's one of the messages of point C. The child in point C, she had loving parents, but they were so obsessed with taking each other down or winning that it essentially destroyed their child emotionally. And that happens in real life over and over and over again. In some cases. In other cases, the parties are able to really put the best interest of the child first and conduct their business with each other in a way which protects the child and doesn't subject them to the type of harm that happened to the child in point C. If you're able to act in a way consciously which lets your child see you act in a consistently mature manner in front of them, even in dealing with an ex-spouse who you no longer love or have issues with, it can be extremely helpful to the child if you're placing the child first. It requires some degree of sacrifice. It requires some degree of self-reflection and some degree of very, very positive parenting to do. It's hard to do. It's hard to deal with an ex-spouse who you may have issues with. But if you're talking about your child's best interests, as opposed to your perceived best interests, it can be very, very helpful and positively influential in your child's growth and development in the future in getting to an appropriate point C.